But the next couple of days were brilliant. People were hospitable, happy, invited me to eat and have a drink, etc. It was like being a volunteer again, a VSO. Everyone was so young, except Ridwit and myself. I was co-principal of a school. The other principal, whose name was Jihad, was from Gaza, and the teachers were Egyptians, Syrians, and Palestinians. Work was good. My expat team were all there in a room. Exams were on, and no work was being done by us or the teachers we were training. I hadn't a clue, of course, what was going on, and I just took as my priority to get to know the principal and the teachers on my team. They were all good people. The students that we were training to teach were a revelation, much better than expected. In the UAE in the 80s, I had taught rather spoiled students at an elite school. They were mostly royals and they were not highly motivated. These students, though, were rough and undisciplined, but they were desert Bedouins and really quite approachable in the main. Mind you, I was glad I didn't have to teach them English. I just had to train them as teachers. On the first day, an American guy, my predecessor, who had been passed over and his job given to me, did two noteworthy things. First, a student approached me and mumbled something. It turned out he had been beaten by the Arabic teacher with a stick. Now, a beating with a stick was one of the things we were trying to discourage. It was tricky because the beaten boy was the son of another teacher. Anyway, my American predecessor saw what was happening, and then he said to me, "This is your first problem, and yours to deal with." And then he walked away. I thought to myself, yeah, thanks, mate. The second thing my American friend did on that day was to fling about 6 ring binders on my desk, full of policies and procedures, and said to me, "Now that's your second problem." The rest of the day went well. I was living in my boss's house, upstairs in a room with no curtains, carpets, or bedside tables. Didn't matter though. While I settled in, downstairs my boss tapped away in silence on his PC. I had a brief but abortive attempt to induce him to converse on several occasions, but like many Englishmen, he quickly let me know that he found my chat boring. Eddie the horse was a good-looking, clean-cut, smooth talker. His head was shaped like a horse. He seemed very nice. I will try to be positive and objective about him, but in the light of what happened eventually, it is difficult for me. I suppose what got me most about him was that all the females seemed to like him, even though he was plainly a boring half-wit. I could not, for the life of me, see what it was they were attracted to. Perhaps it was the suits he wore. I never saw him wear anything else. Perhaps it was the plummy accent, or maybe the boyish good looks. He certainly looked younger than his age. I think he was about 35. He looked like a Boy Scout leader. Who knows? But it was something. The girls loved him, and even some of the more testosterone-driven guys, like the compulsive marathon runner Matt, also liked him. So he must have had something that made them like him. Maybe it was the fact that he smoked one cigarette a day. One cigarette only in the mornings and before breakfast, and he smoked it with such deep breaths, like he needed oxygen to save his life. The strange thing was, it was the only cigarette he smoked in the whole day. In the end, I was convinced that it must have been the shape of his head that attracted the girls. There was simply no other possible explanation. It was freezing, but it didn't really bother me too much at first. 2 days later, suddenly, everything changed. School holidays. Oh, all right. Nobody told me about that. But suddenly, everybody vanished. With no driving license, I panicked and quickly texted Maggie, who was my official buddy. She was also the co-principal of another school. Maggie, can you buy me a carton of Amstel beer when next in Abu Dhabi? Well, yes, Don, but it'll have to be when we come back in February. We're in Cape Town. Maggie, my Aussie buddy, was on holiday. She hadn't thought to introduce herself to me or to tell me she was going on holiday. Oh well. Yeah, February, I thought. That's 2 weeks away. How was I going to survive 2 weeks in MZ without Amstel beer? Well, Maggie was a worldly lady with a history. She had checked up with a mild, meek, and pleasant South African who was out of work called Willie. She was devoted to him. I couldn't understand it. But then I couldn't understand Willie either. He let her treat him like a dog. She was a strong feminist. Well, that's pretty common in Australia. She wasn't popular, though. Everyone had disappeared without saying goodbye to me. And I was wheelless. No vehicle. I made a decision. I was going to get myself and my accommodation sorted out before I tried to get on top of the job. In any case, there was no one in MZ from whom I might get any information about the job for the next 2 weeks. But there was also a problem during the holidays. I couldn't get anything done with regard to my accommodation without the approval of my boss. And Eddie the horse was on a skiing trip in Italy. That's why I was in his house on my own. Since my boss was in Italy skiing, my buddy was in Cape Town, and I had no transport. I couldn't organize my accommodation until he returned. So I decided I would do the same as everybody else, take a holiday. Ireland was just around the corner, about 6 hours away. Ireland was good. I had a chance to re-establish relationships with my brothers and Mum. Mum was pretty healthy, but she got confused at times now. A bit like me now. My brothers and I had not seen each other for many years, and we drifted apart, far apart. One, Philip, had had a health scare, and he had re-established contact recently. I was keen to reciprocate the interest. In Ireland, I knew I could talk to my old friend David Crawford. He usually didn't judge me, he just listened. A plan began to form in my mind. It went something like this. I had to keep earning money, so I would definitely have to go back to Abu Dhabi. Maria, the teenagers, would therefore be able to afford a bigger house. Hopefully, Maria would come and visit me in MZ within a few weeks in order to prevent me from going nuts. While she was away, the younger Nixons would have to fend for themselves. We would all live happily ever after. That was the plan. But I had an attack of phlebitis in my leg on the penultimate day of my week in Ireland. I was hobbling around Hillsborough looking for drugs at a chemist. I decided to call up an old childhood friend who had become a doctor she was a friend of mine from school days in Ireland. And I knew she lived in the Hillsborough area. She'd married a surgeon, and that was that. Just as well for her, I think. Anyway, we blarneyed for a while and chatted on the phone. What about the legs? I said. My legs, I meant. I'm supposed to be flying tomorrow back again to Abu Dhabi. You shouldn't fly, Don, she said. Uh, I thought she wasn't really being serious, and there wasn't really any alternative as far as I could see. Anyway, maybe my wife is right. She says I don't listen to anybody's advice. Meanwhile, I visited Mum, and the conversation was good. She gets a bit, though, confused at times. And where are you living now? In Abu Dhabi, Mum. And you are Philip? Uh, no, Mum, I'm Dawn. And Philip is in Adelaide? No, Mum, I live in Adelaide. And are you married yet? Hmm. The brothers Nixon went on a pilgrimage to Enniskillen. This was where my dad's sister, Aunt Marjorie, used to live. I have many happy memories of visiting her at Easter. She was a very religious lady, a Methodist. Marjorie was a stalwart Methodist and sacrificed her life to look after her mother. She never married and died at the age of 65. She was the happiest Nixon I've ever known. Philip was clearly ill, but he thought he was beating it, and he was in pretty good form. It turned out he wasn't beating it. I was very pleased at the rapprochement between us, because Philip was a bully when we were younger. It was worth the trip, just for that alone. For that alone, because he died a few months later. I flew back to Abu Dhabi and stayed the night with my CEO. Next day, I returned to MZ. After 1 week, I had come back to the United Arab Emirates refreshed, but it took me some time to get on top of things again. Apparently, my previous boss, the one who'd been passed over and hadn't been so helpful on that first day, he chucked a spasm on being asked to deputize in my absence for the week. I don't blame him. Really, he refused anyway, and the horse then had to do the job himself, even though it was remotely mostly. I think this annoyed him. But I don't really blame him either, but he couldn't complain too loudly because he'd been enjoying his skiing holiday in Italy. His head looked even more oblong than usual. My boss was a yuppie with a head that reminded me of a horse. Within just 1 week in Ireland, I had forgotten many things I had learned in Abu Dhabi in my first 13 days. I spent a couple of days then in Abu Dhabi doing management training courses. I resettled in as best as I could and tried to get on with things. Meanwhile, things back in Adelaide seemed to be wobbly. Teenagers were not happy. They were missing their friends in Brunei. I got the impression Maria didn't really want to come to the desert for a month to settle me down and have a holiday. She didn't see it as a priority. I don't blame her either. She had her hands full. I could feel the panic rising, and my anxiety was also rising.